These are the oldest people who have been executed in the United States. We'll talk about their crimes, their last meals, and final words before execution. Walter Leroy Moody, State, Alabama. On May 7, 1972, 37-year-old Walter Moody packaged a homemade pipe bomb that he intended to send to an auto dealer who had repossessed his car. Unfortunately, the package was found by his wife, Hazel, in the kitchen. The bomb exploded and tore up her hand, thigh, and shoulder, and sent scrap metal into her eye. She was alive, but required 6 operations to deal with all of her injuries. A day later, Walter was arrested and soon put on trial for making the bomb. He was not convicted of making, but rather of possessing the bomb, and was sentenced to 5 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. On December 16, 1989, Walter sent a package containing a mail bomb to the Alabama home of federal Judge Robert Vance. He was angered by the judge's refusal to exonerate him in the 1972 bombing case. The resulting explosion killed Judge Vance instantly, while his wife was seriously injured. 7 months later, Walter Leroy Moody was charged with the murder of Judge Vance, as well as 3 other mail bombing cases. Right before the trial began, all the circuit and district judges in Georgia were asked not to participate in the case because of a potential bias, as Walter had repeatedly targeted several attorneys and judges. Thus, on June 4, 1991, his trial was transferred to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to 7 life imprisonments. However, in 1997, an Alabama court sentenced Walter to death for the murder of Judge Vance. 21 years later, on April 19, 2018, Walter Leroy Moody was executed by electrocution at the age of 83 years and 26 days, making him the oldest inmate ever executed in the U.S. For his final meal, Walter asked for Philly cheesesteaks, Dr. Pepper, and M&Ms. He declined to make a final statement before being strapped to the chair. John Marion Grant, State, Oklahoma. On the morning of November 13, 1998, John Marion Grant, who had been serving a life sentence in the Dick Connor Correctional Center, argued with the guard Gay Carter over his breakfast tray. It soon escalated, and Grant ended up stabbing Carter 16 times in the chest with a prison-made shank. Grant fled and attempted to stab himself with the shank, but the prison officials soon subdued him. On May 8, 2000, Grant was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Grant's legal team made several attempts to change his sentence to life without parole. In fact, in 2014, they even claimed that an alleged romantic relationship between Grant and Carter was the motivation behind the murder. However, in early October 2021, the Oklahoma Parole and Pardons Board rejected all appeals and upheld Grant's death sentence. One day before his execution, Grant was given a last meal. He requested 2 bacon cheeseburgers with onion, tomato, pickles, lettuce, and mustard, as well as barbecue chips, a half-gallon of Neapolitan ice cream, a large pack of Nutter Butter sandwich cookies, and a 2-liter bottle of Mr. Pibb. On October 28, 2021, John Marion Grant was executed by lethal injection. As the execution began, Grant shouted, "Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!" before the microphone in the death chamber was turned off. When receiving the first dose of injection, Grant began violently convulsing and vomiting for several minutes before a second injection was administered. Eventually, 21 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed that Grant suffered from pulmonary edema, with his lungs being heavy with fluid, suggesting he experienced a swift buildup of fluid that can create a feeling of suffocation or drowning. John Marion Grant's death was painful. Brandon Astor Jones, State, Georgia. On June 17, 1979, Brandon Astor Jones and an accomplice entered a Tenneco convenience store, robbed all the money from the front counter, and attempted to flee. During this process, an altercation broke out, and Jones shot the store manager, Roger Tackett, dead. A few hours later, both Jones and his accomplice were arrested at the crime scene and sent to prison. On October 17, 1979, Jones was sentenced to death for his involvement in felony murder. In 1989, a federal court ordered Jones to be resentenced because the jurors who had convicted him had improperly brought a Bible into the deliberation room. However, he was once again sentenced to death in 1997. During his time on death row, Jones's attorneys filed appeals to stop his execution by challenging Georgia's injection drug secrecy law. They also argued that the death penalty was too harsh a punishment for his crime. However, both the appeals were rejected, and on February 3, 2016, Jones was executed, 10 days before his 73rd birthday. The executioner team struggled for 45 minutes to insert the IV into Jones's veins before a doctor in attendance inserted it into Jones' groin. He was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. Prior to his execution, Jones declined to make a final statement in front of witnesses but agreed to have a prayer read. He had also declined a last meal request and instead ate from the standard prison menu. Cecil Clayton, State, Missouri. On November 26, 1996, police officer Christopher Castetter responded to a call about a burglary in Missouri. When he reached the spot, he was confronted by 56-year-old Cecil Clayton, who was armed with a pistol. In the subsequent altercation, Clayton shot Officer Castetter, who died on the spot. Clayton was arrested and taken to prison barely a few hours later. In 1997, he was put on trial and was swiftly sentenced to death for the murder of an officer on duty. But the whole case quickly grabbed the attention of the media. Clayton had lost about a fifth of his frontal lobe in a freak accident about 5 years prior to the murder. He was working in a sawmill when a splinter from a log broke off and slammed into his skull. His lawyers pointed out that the damage rendered him mentally incompetent and therefore ineligible for capital punishment. They also argued that the accident had a long-term impact on his behavior, ranging from uncontrolled rage to hallucinations and depression. The case was even taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, but ultimately, none of the justices accepted the claims. Thus, on March 17, 2015, Cecil Clayton was executed through lethal injection in the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center, Missouri, at the age of 74. While he was being brought to the execution table, Clayton was fully aware and said, "They brought me up here to execute me." There are no records of his last meal. Billy Wayne Cauble, State, Texas. On October 29, 1989, Billy Wayne Cauble, armed with a rifle, arrived in the small town of Axtell. He visited the houses of his ex-wife's parents as well as her brother and shot everyone dead. He then entered the house of his estranged wife, Karen, where her 2 kids were playing. When Karen came home from work, she found her children tied up. Cauble approached her and told her that he had killed her parents and brother. At gunpoint, he then led her to the car and tried to flee with her. But Karen fought back, and eventually a sheriff's deputy began following them before Cauble crashed into a parked car. In 1990, Cauble was put on trial where the prosecution showed extremely incriminating evidence. He had a long history of brutalizing and molesting women, including his former wives and young girls. The jury also heard evidence that Cauble had a traumatizing childhood, and that he was enlisted to fight in the Vietnam War at age 17. Nonetheless, in June 1990, he was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death. On February 28, 2019, Billy Wayne Cauble was executed in Texas via lethal injection. Right before the execution, the 70-year-old was asked if he wanted to address the invited onlookers. Cauble replied, "Yes, sir, that will be $5. I love you, and I love you." As he was finishing his statement, his son Gordon, grandson Dalton, and daughter-in-law became emotional and violent. Specifics about Billy Wayne Cauble's last meal are not available. Manuel Valle, State, Florida. On April 2, 1978, Officer Luis Pena of the Coral Gables Police Department was on patrol when he stopped Valle and a companion for a traffic violation. Shortly thereafter, Pena used his radio to run a license check on the car. Valle took this opportunity to walk back to his car and reached into it for a gun. He then approached Officer Pena and fired a single shot at him, which resulted in his death. Valle also fired 2 shots at another officer, Gary Spell, and then fled. 2 days later, he was arrested in Deerfield Beach and taken to jail. In 1982, Valle was put on trial and was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Pena and the attempted first-degree murder of Spell. After spending almost 3 decades on death row in solitary confinement, the Florida governor eventually signed his death warrant. On September 28, 2011, Valle was executed by lethal injection. It contained a newly revised mix of lethal drugs, including an anesthetic that has not been tested for executions. He was pronounced dead at 7:14 p.m. local time. There are no official records of his last words or last meal. Carl Wayne Buneton, State, Texas. On June 27, 1990, Carl Wayne Bunchen and his friend were traveling across Houston when 37-year-old Officer James Irby pulled the vehicle over. Bunchen had a deep-seated anger against the police as his twin brother was killed during a shootout almost 2 decades ago. So when Irby began speaking with the driver, Bunchen exited the vehicle and shot the officer to death, once in the head and twice in the back. Bunchen then fled the scene but continued shooting at others who were nearby before he was eventually arrested. The next year, in 1991, Bunchen was put on trial for the murder of Officer Irby. The process was swift, and he was quickly sentenced to death on January 24, 1991. After 30 years on death row, Bunchen's lawyers filed an application that claimed that it would be cruel to execute Bunchen given the amount of time he had spent incarcerated. However, on April 19, 2022, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected Bunchen's request for clemency and voted unanimously to sentence him to death. On April 21, 2022, Carl Wayne Buneton was executed through lethal injection at the age of 78. When asked for his final words, Bunchen said, "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did. I pray to God that they get closure for me killing their father and Miss Irby's husband. To all of my friends that stuck with me through all of these years, I am not going to say goodbye, just saying so long. I am ready to go to heaven, Warden." Bunchen didn't ask for any special last meal, as he'd been suffering from pneumonia and a head injury. Betty Lou Beets, State, Texas. On August 6, 1983, 46-year-old Betty Lou Beets filed a report that her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, was missing. However, in the early hours of that day, Betty had shot Jimmy twice, killing him in their home near Cedar Creek Lake in Texas. Her son, Robert, returned to the house 2 hours after the murder. Betty forced him to conceal the body in the front yard of the house. After disposing of it, she telephoned the police and pretended that her husband never returned from a fishing trip. Exactly 2 years after the incident, the police searched the Beets' home and found the remains of Jimmy Don in a wishing well. They also found the remains of her 4th husband in a garage. Investigation concluded that both had been shot with a .38 caliber pistol. On July 11, 1985, she was put on a trial where she pleaded not guilty, claiming that 2 of her children had committed the murders. However, prosecutors found out that she had killed Jimmy Don for his insurance money. 3 months later, she was convinced of both the murders and sentenced to death. While Betty was on death row, her legal team tried to get a stay on her execution. The process dragged on for decades before all her appeals were denied in 1999. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed in the Huntsville unit via a lethal injection. She did not request a final meal, nor did she make a final statement. James Barnes, State, Florida. On April 20, 1988, 41-year-old nurse Patricia Miller had just arrived at her home in Melbourne, Florida. Unbeknownst to her, 26-year-old James Barnes quietly entered through a bedroom window with a knife. He confronted her at knife point before sexually assaulting her. Barnes then bludgeoned Patricia with a hammer and bound her with his shoelaces while she was lying face down on the bed. In an attempt to hide his crimes, Barnes set fire to her bed. A medical examiner later determined that Patricia had died from blunt force trauma to the head and had been killed before the fire was started. On December 12, 1997, police arrested Barnes at his house after he had strangled his ex-wife, Linda, to death. On January 9, 1998, Barnes pled guilty to murdering Linda and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, in 2005, Barnes, who had converted to Islam, confessed to the unsolved murder of Patricia Miller while fasting during Ramadan. At his trial for Miller's murder, Barnes waived his right to a jury and represented himself. A year later, he pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Miller and was sentenced to death. While awaiting his death row, Barnes was interviewed at Florida State Prison by German filmmaker Werner Herzog. 6 weeks later, he sent a letter to Herzog admitting responsibility for 2 more unsolved murders. On August 3, 2023, Barnes was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison at age 61. Before the execution, he declined a last meal and remained silent when asked for a final statement. Donald Beardsley, State, California. In 1969, young Laura Griffin met 26-year-old Donald Beardsley in a club in Missouri. The two immediately hit it off and began to drink and dance together before heading to his home. There, Donald choked, stabbed, and drowned Laura. He turned himself in and confessed to the killing, but no motive was established, nor did he offer any explanation. Beardsley pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, received a 19-year sentence, and served 7 years before being released on parole in 1977. On April 5, 1981, while out on parole, Beardsley murdered 2 more women, a 19-year-old and a 23-year-old, during a drug deal gone wrong. Beardsley's phone number was found near the crime site, and when police called, he confessed and led them to the body of one of the victims. He was put on trial a few days later, and the defense tried to appeal on grounds of mental defect due to a head injury when he was 21. However, since he was a repeat offender by this time, Beardsley was sentenced to death. On January 19, 2005, Donald Beardsley was executed in California by means of lethal injection. Prior to the execution, he had denied any last meal and refused to make any last statements. Jack Alderman, State, Georgia. On September 21, 1974, Jack Alderman asked his colleague, John Arthur Brown, to come to his apartment. When the two met, Alderman handed Brown a 12-inch crescent wrench and instructed him to go into the bedroom and kill his wife, Barbara Alderman. He even threatened to shoot Brown if he didn't comply. Shortly afterwards, Brown entered the dining room and struck Barbara in the head with the wrench. She cried out and ran into the living room, where her husband placed his hands over her nose and mouth until she was dead. The two then disposed of her body by placing it in a car near a creek in Rincon, Georgia, and fleeing away from the scene. However, later that day, 2 motorists saw a woman's body inside the car near the creek and informed the police. A full-scale investigation was launched that traced the crime back to John Arthur Brown, who eventually gave a statement incriminating both himself and Alderman. On June 14, 1975, Alderman was convicted for his part in the killing of his wife and was subsequently sentenced to death. The prosecutors maintained that Jack Alderman attempted to defraud $20,000 from his wife's life insurance, which was provided for by her employer. Due to various appeals by Alderman's legal team, as well as cases on the constitutionality of lethal injection, Alderman spent 33 years on death row. Eventually, on September 16, 2008, he was executed by lethal injection in Georgia. He declined any last meals or words before his execution. Leroy Nash, State, Arizona. As an exception in our list, we have the case of Leroy Nash, who was sentenced to death, but due to his old age, the punishment was never carried out. In 1930, 15-year-old Leroy Nash went to jail for the first time in his life for armed robbery. In 1947, at 32 years old, he was involved in a shooting of a police officer in Connecticut. He was put on trial in the same year and served 25 years behind bars for his involvement in the crime. In 1977, he once again was involved in a murder, this time of a postal carrier. However, Leroy would escape from jail at the age of 66 and flee to Arizona. Unfortunately, in 1982, he went into a coin shop in Phoenix and shot an employee dead. In 1983, Nash, who was 68 at the time, was sentenced to death. His attorneys claimed that he was legally incompetent to be executed due to senility. The sentence was never carried out, and Nash died of natural causes on February 12, 2010, at the age of 94 in the Arizona Amen State Prison Complex. At the time of his death, he was the oldest person on death row in the U.S. John Nixon, State, Mississippi. On January 22, 1985, Thomas Tucker and his wife, Virginia, were enjoying their newly married life when John Nixon, his son, and an associate arrived at their home. Upon entering the house, Nixon pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and confronted the couple. Tucker immediately realized that the men were hired by his wife's ex-husband. In a desperate move, he offered money to spare their lives, but Nixon replied, "The deal's already been made." He and one of his associates then shot at Tucker, who managed to escape despite being hit in the side. Nixon then fired a shot into Virginia's head, killing her on the spot. After this, Nixon and his associates fled the scene. A few days later, Nixon was arrested, and Tucker quickly identified him in a lineup at the police station. On March 26, 1986, Nixon was put on trial in Rankin County, Mississippi. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with a severe passive-aggressive personality disorder, but the jury convicted Nixon of capital murder and sentenced him to death. For almost 2 decades, Nixon's lawyers tried to get him off the death row by pointing out that he would be little danger to society and should be able to live out the rest of his days in prison. However, on December 10, 2005, Governor of Mississippi Haley Barbour denied clemency for Nixon. A day before his execution, Nixon was given a last meal. He requested a well-done T-bone steak, buttered asparagus spears, a baked potato with sour cream, peach pie, vanilla ice cream, and sweet tea. On December 14, 2005, Nixon was executed by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at the age of 77. When asked for his final words, Nixon said, "I did not kill Virginia Tucker. I know within my heart, and it hurts to acknowledge, that it was a son of mine and a Spanish friend and another man from Jackson." Clarence Ray Allen, State, California. In 1974, security business owner Clarence Ray Allen manipulated his son and 2 guards into an elaborate burglary plot of a successful supermarket named Franz Market. They stole $500 in cash and $10,000 in money orders. However, the next day, an employee named Mary Sue Kitts saw Allen cashing the stolen money orders. Kitts was strangled to death and her body dumped in a canal by one of Allen's guards later that week. 3 years later, the same guard confessed, and in March of 1978, Allen was arrested. He was quickly convicted of burglary and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment on March 16th of the same year. While he was imprisoned in Folsom Prison, Allen conspired with a fellow inmate to murder every witness who had testified against him. On September 5, 1980, Byron Schladewitz and 2 others were murdered in Franz Market on Allen's orders. In 1980, the California Attorney General filed charges against Allen in this same case, and 2 years later a trial began. The whole process lasted 23 days, and 58 witnesses were called to testify. Ultimately, the jury convicted Allen of triple murder and conspiracy to murder 8 witnesses. On December 2, 1989, Allen was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. Years later, his lawyer argued that Allen was already old and presented no danger, and that his life should be spared. However, on January 13, 2006, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger upheld his death sentence, stating that his actions were calculated decisions of a mature man. A day before his execution, Allen was given a last meal. He requested buffalo steak, bread, a bucket of KFC white meat-only chicken, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free walnut ice cream, and whole milk. On January 17, 2006, the day after his 76th birthday, Allen was executed by lethal injection at California's San Quentin State Prison. He needed 2 injections before his heart finally stopped beating. Prior to death, Allen wrote, "My last words will be, Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much. I love you all. Goodbye." Bigler Stouffer, State, Oklahoma. On January 24, 1985, builder Douglas Scottavines was at home when his ex-wife's boyfriend, Bigler Stouffer, arrived huffing and puffing. Stouffer claimed that his ex-wife was in danger and that he needed a gun to protect her. Ivins obliged and handed him a .38 caliber pistol, only for Stouffer to use it on him 3 times. He then approached Ivins' girlfriend, Linda K. Reeves, and shot her twice in the head, killing her on the spot. Miraculously, Ivins, who had sustained 3 gunshots, including 1 to the face, survived. Barely an hour later, Stouffer was arrested in his own home. He was taken to Oklahoma County Jail, where he called his girlfriend and told her that he shot both Ivins and Reeves in a phone conversation. On June 27, 1985, Bigler Stouffer stood trial for 1 count of murder and another of attempted murder at the Oklahoma County District Court. During the trial, Stouffer denied that he murdered Reeves and claimed that she was already dead when he arrived at Ivins. He also claimed that he shot Ivins in self-defense while they were both fighting for the gun. However, on July 1, 1985, after 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Stouffer guilty of all charges and sentenced him to the death penalty. Despite multiple appeals, his death sentence was upheld. 1 day before his execution, Stouffer was offered a last meal. He declined to make any special requests, but accepted a final meal of regular prison food, consisting of 1 chicken burger, 2 slices of bread, chips, broccoli, mixed fruit, 2 biscuits, a fruit drink, and 1 bottle of water. On December 9, 2021, 79-year-old Bigler Stufer was executed via lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. When asked for his final words, he said, "My request is that my father forgive them. Thank you." Stauffer was pronounced dead at 10:16 a.m. Lester Bauer, State, California. On October 8, 1983, Lester Bauer, a happily married father of two with no criminal record, went into an airplane hangar in Texas. He was trying to steal an ultralight aircraft that he had previously agreed to buy for about $4,500. Unfortunately, four men, Bob Tate, Jerry Brown, Philip Good, and Ronald Mays, were also present in the same hangar. They were all shot in the head at close range, and Bauer was later arrested after pieces of the aircraft were found at his home. In late 1983, Bauer was put on trial, where prosecutors argued that he had killed Tate in order to steal an aircraft. He then killed the other three men when they unexpectedly showed up at the hangar. Investigators had found Fiocchi ammunition similar to what was used in the killings. The prosecution argued that the ammunition provided a vital link, as its type was very rare. On April 28, 1984, Bauer was found guilty of 4 counts of capital murder and was sentenced to death. After Bauer's conviction, his lawyers argued that the prosecution had withheld information relating to a police tip that the killings may have been connected to drug trafficking, noting that the victim Tate had a history of selling cocaine. Several witnesses came forward in later years who said that Bauer had nothing to do with the murders. The defense lawyers also argued that the Fiocchi ammunition type was not rare. It was widely sold for small game shooting and practice shooting, and the state prosecutors knew this at the trial. Numerous appeals had been brought since Bauer's conviction, questioning how he was sentenced to death, despite there being no physical evidence pinning him to the crime scene. However, on June 3, 2015, Bauer was executed by lethal injection in the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, Bauer said, "I have fought the good fight. I held my faith. I am not going to say goodbye. I will simply say, until we meet again. I love you very, very much." There are no known records of his last meal. Danny Bible, State, Texas. In May 1979, when 20-year-old neighbor Inez Deaton came to Danny Bible's house to use the telephone, he raped her before stabbing her 11 times in the head and chest with an ice pick. He then put the body in his car and abandoned it at a nearby bayou. On May 16, 1983, Bible, who was on the run, murdered 3 more people, including 21-year-old Pamela Hudgens. The police, however, were onto him, and Bible was eventually arrested in Florida a few months later. In August of 1984, he was given a 25-year sentence for the murder of Pamela Hudgens, as the police didn't have enough evidence to link him to any other case. Unfortunately, by 1993, Bible was out of prison under mandatory supervision after serving 9 years of his original sentence. He went on to assault yet another woman and was promptly arrested in Fort Myers by federal authorities. While awaiting trial for the new charge, he spontaneously confessed to the murders he had committed in Texas and at least 9 rapes. Finally, after 19 years of committing the crime, Bible was put on trial for the rape and murder of Inez Dalton. In June 2003, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder after just 3 hours of deliberation, and he was sentenced to death. Over the following decade, Bible and his lawyers submitted multiple appeals to have his death sentence commuted, with his final one being rejected by the Supreme Court in 2016. On June 27, 2018, Bible was executed at the Huntsville unit via lethal injection. While he had no final words, reporters from the Houston Chronicle claimed that he had uttered the words "it hurts" and "burning" after being injected. There are no official records of his final meal. Frank Jarvis Atwood, State, Arizona. On September 17, 1984, 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson took her bicycle and rode off to drop a letter in a mailbox near her home in Tucson, Arizona. She never returned home even after hours, and the local authorities started investigating the matter. Their suspicions fell on 28-year-old Los Angeles man named Frank Jarvis Atwood, who was seen driving aggressively around the area. During questioning, Atwood told investigators that he was in Vicki's neighborhood on September 17th and was staying in a nearby park. he was a drug addict and already had a case running on him for the sexual abuse of an 8-year-old boy in California. On April 12, 1985, the remains of Vicky were discovered in the Sonoran Desert, 32 kilometers away from where her bike was found. Thus, 2 years later, Atwood was officially put on trial for first-degree murder and was swiftly sentenced to death on May 8, 1987. During his years on death row, Atwood got married, got baptized in the Greek Orthodox Christian Church, obtained a bachelor's degree in pre-law and a master's degree in literature. He even wrote 6 books, 5 of which have been published. Throughout the next few decades, Atwood claimed that police tampered with the evidence found on his car, and that no physical evidence had been found placing Vicky in his car. However, all his appeals for judicial re-review of his case were denied. A day before his execution, Atwood accepted a meal tray that included a selection of salami, mustard, peanut butter, jelly, wheat bread, a snack bag of tortilla chips, and 1 drink of water with a juice packet as his last meal. On June 8, 2022, Atwood was executed by lethal injection at the state prison in Florence, Arizona. In his last statement, Atwood maintained his innocence and did not apologize to the family of Vicky Hoskinson. His last words were, "Thank you, precious Father, for coming today and shepherding me into faith. I want to thank my beautiful wife who has loved me with everything she has. I want to thank my friends and legal team, and most of all, Jesus Christ through this unfair judicial process that led to my salvation. I pray the Lord will have mercy on all of us, and that the Lord will have mercy on me." John Battaglia, State, Texas. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia was supposed to look after his 2 daughters, Faith and Liberty, after his estranged wife Mary left for a dinner event. But he instead took them into his apartment in Dallas and called Mary. With her on the phone, John shot 9-year-old Faith 3 times and 6-year-old Liberty 5 times with his gun. A distraught Mary terminated the call and immediately dialed 911. Shortly afterwards, John was apprehended from a tattoo parlor where he got into a fistfight with the arresting police officers. On April 22, 2002, John Battaglia was put on trial, and it took the jurors only 19 minutes to convict him of the highest charge, capital murder. During the penalty phase of the trial, John's lawyers argued that their client should not receive the death penalty because he had bipolar disorder. However, on April 30, 2002, John Battaglia was sentenced to death, and he was scheduled to be executed on March 30, 2016. While he was on death row, John's lawyers managed to postpone the date of execution, stating that he was not mentally competent to be executed. But on September 20, 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed these claims and pointed out that John was likely faking symptoms of mental illness. On February 1, 2018, John Battaglia was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit, nearly 16 years after his original sentencing. His last words came upon seeing his ex-wife as he said, "Well, hi, Mary Jean," before turning to the warden and stated, "I'll see y'all later. Bye. Go ahead, please." There are no official records of his last meal. Robert Anthony Buell, State, Ohio. On July 17, 1982, 11-year-old Krista Harrison and a friend were playing in a park near their homes in Marshallville, Ohio. Shortly afterwards, a man between 25 and 35 with shoulder-length hair drove up to Harrison in his van, forced her into the vehicle, and drove away. 6 days later, her remains were discovered next to a shed 35 miles from the abduction site. No one was arrested for a year, despite a $10,000 reward for information about the abductor. In 1983, 43-year-old Robert Anthony Buell, employed by the state of Ohio, kidnapped a 28-year-old woman who was working as a manager at a gas station in Damascus, Ohio. She was able to escape 12 hours later and notified police after her attacker had left to go to work. Police then promptly arrested Buell and started an investigation. They also compared the orange carpet fibers found on Harrison's body to the ones in Buell's van. It was a match, and records indicated that Buell had purchased the same type of box that was used to conceal Harrison's body. In 1984, Buell was put on trial, where he pleaded no contest to the abduction and rape of the adult victim, but denied any involvement with Harrison's murder. Nonetheless, he was sentenced to death for the abduction, torture, and murder of Krista Harrison. A day before his execution, Buell requested his final meal, a single olive. On September 25, 2002, Rovert Anthony Buell was executed by lethal injection. Just before he was strapped to the execution table, Buell addressed Harrison's parents, saying, "Jerry and Shirley, I didn't kill your daughter. The prosecutor knows that, and they left the real killer out there on the streets to kill again and again and again.